In a remote corner of Kansas, lived Jack, a strong and stubborn farmer, married to Emma, a feisty and strong-willed woman. With the arrival of autumn, Emma announced to her husband that they would soon be parents. Jack was overcome with a mixture of joy and concern. "You will give birth at home, as will all the women in our family," Jack said firmly, evoking ancient traditions. "But Jack, this time it's different." "I feel like it's more complicated," Emma responded with a slight hesitation, looking into his eyes with fear. Jack flatly refused to consider a clinic, as the cost would be too outsized for him, a staggering $8,000. For him, home birth was more a matter of pride than economics. Between painful contractions, Emma finally unleashed all her doubts and fears in the makeshift delivery room of her cozy home. The agony lasted for hours, and Jack, horrified by the anguish of his beloved wife, finally gave in to reality. There were no options, they had to go to the clinic. So it was. Once there, after a complicated birth, Emma brought her son into the world. Jack and Emma sighed with relief and gratitude at seeing their little one safe and sound. But joy was quickly replaced by anxiety when the $8,000 clinic bill arrived. Jack firmly handed the paper to Emma and crossed her arms. "You insisted on coming here, you have to pay these costs." Suspense settled like a dense cloud over them. Emma looked at her husband in disbelief, feeling anger and indignation swirling inside her. "Did I not suffer more than any woman should suffer? And isn't he also our son?" It seemed that the peace they had sought since the conception of their son had now become the perfect storm. She stared at him in silence, holding the bill in her trembling hands. The tension could be cut with a knife inside that hospital room, while a small bundle slept peacefully in the crib next to her, oblivious to all the commotion. Emma's gaze locked on Jack as indignation grew in her veins. The world seemed to have stopped there in the cold hospital room, and for a moment, the only sound was the quiet whisper of his newborn son sleeping. "Are you saying you won't take responsibility for this?" she asked, smothering a tremble in her voice as she held up the bill like they were divorce papers. "Do you really think I should bear these costs alone?" Jack, normally a man of firm convictions, seemed to hesitate. It's just a sum of money." Emma interrupted, "A sum for your son's life, Jack." After that, silence fell over the room, only broken by the soft snort of her sleeping baby. Emma turned to her son, her saturated expression softening as she gazed into his innocent face. Her eyes filled with tears, not from pain, but from frustration and abandonment. In the following days, the tension remained. The inhabitants of the small town quickly learned of the conflict and opinions began to fly like leaves in a tornado. Some supported Jack, citing old customs and traditions, while others openly sympathized with Emma. The shadow of hospital debt continued to loom over the couple as they debated and argued, but the most painful thing for Emma was not the money, but the lack of support from her husband. She wondered if they would ever find common ground again, and if he would ever understand the sacrifice she made for his son. As the weeks passed, the tense atmosphere in the house continued. Conversations were reduced to a minimum, hugs became cold and silence grew, turning their home into an inhospitable place full of unexpressed resentments. Emma's unshed tears were silenced by the bubbly laughter of her young son. And even as she looked at him, smiling through the battle within her, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever be able to regain the happiness that once filled her life. Meanwhile, Jack struggled with his own internal dilemmas. Every time he passed by his little one's room and saw his son's mother overcome with emotion, he felt a searing pain in his heart. But his farmer's pride got in the way, blinding her to his mistake. Would he finally give in and help Emma with her hospital bill? Or would he maintain his stubborn insistence on placing the financial burden on his shoulders? Only time would tell if this husband and father could overcome his prejudice and pride to save his grieving family. Time passed slowly at Jack and Emma's house. The laughter of her baby filled the gaps of silence, but the tension remained, a shadow slowly consuming the light of her home. One day, while Emma was in the kitchen, she encountered a familiar face at the door. It was Dr. Matthews, the doctor who had delivered her. "I was in town and thought I'd visit the mother and baby," he said with a kind smile. Emma ushered her in, grateful for her distraction. After a brief chat and an examination of the child, the doctor stood up to leave, but not before expressing his concern. "It's not my place, Emma, but I love you. If you or Jack need help with the bill, we could consider a payment plan." "Thank you, doctor," Emma replied calmly, her face serious but grateful. As the door closed behind him, Jack entered the room. He had heard the conversation from the half-open door. Alone in his room that night, a battle raged inside Jack. His face was wrinkled with worry, and he struggled with his stubbornness and his love for his family. He looked through the half-open door at the crib next to Emma and the sleeping baby. That night, Jack's heart changed. The next morning, Emma found her husband standing in front of her with an envelope in his hand, a serious expression on her face. Silently, he handed Emma the envelope. Inside, there was a check for the full amount of the hospital bill. He stared at her, searching for the right words. "It wasn't fair to delegate all of this to you, Em. I've been a fool," she said slowly with remorse in her voice. Emma looked at Jack, tears glistening in her eyes as the weeks-long tension finally began to dissipate. No more words were needed, just one look dehydrated all the grudges and all the bad moments. Several months later, the autumn leaves began to fall and the small family house regained its warm essence. Jack's pride, though wounded, was not broken. He had learned a valuable lesson about love and responsibility. His son was sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, finally in a tension-free home. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that change you for the better. He had learned that lesson the hard way possible, but it had been worth it, because the home he had dreamed of for his family had finally come true. Jack had learned that love is not about standing firm in your own convictions, but about giving in when the well-being of those you love is at stake. And that marked the final triumph of his history. If you like these stories, please subscribe and like the video. This will help these stories reach more people.